It was my birthday last Saturday. I turned quarter of a century old. I'm 25 now. So there's actually been probably a dozen things this past week where I have felt very, very cared for. But in particular, one of my students, it's the first birthday present I've ever gotten from a student. They brought me a succulent on Tuesday, which was very sweet of them. Now, if you know me, I am really, really bad at keeping plants alive. So I told her, I'm so sorry if this dies because I really appreciate it, but I might accidentally kill it. She gave me it on Tuesday. Thursday, she comes to me and she says, Miss, I heard that you have not watered that plant. And I went, it's been 2 days. I feel like 2 days. I don't need to water a succulent in 2 days. But anyway, she cared for me in that moment. I apparently potentially might not be able to care for the plant, but that's okay. So we've been on a journey through Ruth, looking at how we as a church can learn from Ruth how to be a community which commits to each other, how to be a community that is kind to each other. And then this week, we are going to look at how we can be a community that cares for each other. And the one thing I want all of us to leave here knowing is that it is all of our responsibilities to make sure that everyone in this community, whether inside the church or beyond the walls of the church, feels cared for and looked after. And ultimately, this is a responsibility that we are given when we put our trust in Jesus. This is our responsibility in us playing our part in God's plan of redemption. So, a little bit of a recap, if you haven't been here the past 2 weeks, a recap of Ruth. At the very beginning of the book of Ruth, there are two characters, Elimelech and Naomi, and they get married. They have 2 sons, and they live in a place called Bethlehem. And unfortunately, famine drives them out of their home, so they decide to move to Moab. When they get there, their 2 sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. And then, unfortunately, disaster strikes, and all the men in their family die. So Elimelech and then Orpah and Ruth's husbands all unfortunately die. And so Naomi, hearing that there is a bit of a surplus back in Bethlehem, decides, I'm not going to be looked after here. I don't have family, so I'll return to my hometown and somehow be able to look after myself there. So she decides to return home, but she insists to Orpah and Ruth, stay here with your family, be looked after by your actual family, don't come with me. Orpah decides to do that and stay home, but Ruth is very loyal to Naomi and goes with her. So when they get to Bethlehem, Ruth starts to glean in a field, and what that means is basically, as the people who harvest the field, they will always leave little leftovers, and these particularly for the poor in the community and for vulnerable women like Ruth and Naomi. So she's gleaning in Boaz's field, and he's very kind to her and then offers her protection and some of his crop. So this is where we left off last week at the end of chapter 2. So if you have a Bible or on your phone, physical Bible, want to open up to chapter 3 in Ruth, that's where we're going to be starting from today. The first 6 verses in Ruth chapter 3, I'm not going to read through them, but basically what they are is Naomi gives these instructions for Ruth to prepare herself, to put nice clothes on, put some perfume on, and then to go to Boaz in the middle of him sleeping in a field and to lay at her feet. This was a way of her basically offering herself up as a servant to Boaz, but also to claim to him, you are our kinsman redeemer, which we're about to read. So marry me, please, so I can be looked after. So in Ruth 3, we're going to read on from verse 7 through 13. And it says this. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another one who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, Good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So, a kinsman redeemer, not typically a word or a phrase we use in today's society, but in Hebrew it's also known as goel, G-O-E-L, goel. The aim of this, and if you look back in Deuteronomy 25, it actually talks about it. The aim was if a man died, his name and his family line would not die with him or be vulnerable to the whims of other people. So because Ruth's husband died, and Naomi's other son and husband died, Ruth and Naomi are obviously left very vulnerable without husbands to protect them, because back then in that society, the men were the ones who, helped look after the women. So, sorry, lost my place. So Ruth, what was I saying? Ruth, kinsman redeemer. Sorry, guys. This was a very bold gesture to proclaim to Boaz that basically he laid at the feet of his feet and said, when he woke up and found her, she said to him actually, marry me, please. So Boaz, being the honorable gentleman he is, goes on to say that he believes there's actually someone closer in line, so who would be first in line to marry Ruth, should he accept. So he needs to do his duty and make sure that he does not want to take on Ruth. So in Ruth 4, we're going to skip to Ruth 4, verses 1 through 10, we're going to continue reading. So in verse 1, it says, meanwhile, Boaz went to the town gate and sat down there, just as the garden redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. Then he said to the garden redeemer, Naomi, who had come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, he said. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire the Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the garden redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the garden redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also required Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. So Boaz goes to the city gate to meet the first in line kinsman redeemer, and this guy, we don't actually know his name, initially offers to take on his duty, but after hearing that he will take on Ruth as well, he decides to decline the offer. Not really sure, it might have been because she was an outsider to Beth. He realized that actually that's a lot more responsibility than I realized originally I was getting myself into. But Boaz then publicly accepts marrying Ruth and taking on responsibility to protect her and Naomi. And the elders witness affirm this, and so Ruth and Naomi are both redeemed by Boaz, and the family name can be carried on. The end, basically. All right? So what does this all have to do with us being a community that cares? Well, the very first thing is we reflect God's character when we care. So Boaz reflected God's kindness in the way he looked after Ruth when she first started gleaning in his field. Not only did he make sure none of the men would harm her, but told the workers to leave behind some of the good crops for her. Boaz then went on to take on his duty as the kinsman redeemer, ensuring that two vulnerable women would be looked after and cared for. So in the same way Boaz was kind and faithful to Ruth, we too should be a visible expression of God's love, not only in the way that we speak or act, but especially in the way that we care and serve others. When we care for others, we reflect the way Jesus has called us to live. And in James 2:14, It reads, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." So, the first way we can be a caring community is to reflect God's character in all that we do. In the way Boaz cared for Ruth, took her on to marry her, and to take care of her and Naomi, we should too look after the people inside this church and look after the people outside in our Portsmouth community as well. So the second thing, when we care, we become part of God's redemption story. So when I was reading Ruth's story originally, I felt like it's quite your typical, has anyone ever heard of a Hallmark movie? No? Is that just an American thing? Or if you know your typical Hollywood, storyline in films, girl meets boy, Ruth meets Boaz, girl lays at boy's feet, that's maybe not so typical in a Hollywood film, but they get married, they have a child, and then their grandson becomes king of Israel. And then the Savior of the world, Jesus Christ, just so happens to be a descendant of Ruth's grandson. It's a really good Hollywood ending, actually. And we read, actually, at the beginning of Matthew 1, verse 1, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. There's two people mentioned, the son of David, Ruth's grandson, and the son of Abraham, one of the Old Testament characters. And then Matthew actually goes on to list, and I didn't want to put it up there because it's very long, okay? Matthew goes on to list his genealogy, Jesus' genealogy, all the way from Abraham to Jesus. And not only is Boaz mentioned, but Ruth too. Boaz chose to step into God's story when he decided to care for Ruth. Ruth chose to step into God's story when she decided to be loyal to Naomi and help support her and move back to Bethlehem with her. What I find really cool about the story of Ruth is that there are only 85 verses in the entire book. It's very small, actually. But the word redeemed, or some form of redeem, shows up 23 times. Now, I'm a math teacher, so I obviously had to do the calculations on this. 23 times out of 85 verses, that's 27% of the book mentions redemption. All right, so over a quarter of the book of Ruth mentions redemption. Ruth's story is a beautiful testament to God's big plan and beautiful plan of redemption that is weaved throughout the entire Bible. So we've got all the way back to Genesis. In the very beginning, God created everything in the universe. Adam and Eve, were the first humans created, lived in harmony, walking side by side with God. But then, unfortunately, they ate of the apple and sin entered the world. And humans, over and over, for the rest of time, have perpetuated that gap that separated us from God. But God had a rescue plan, Jesus Christ, our ultimate kinsman redeemer. And along the way to Jesus, he used people like Ruth and Naomi to show that he uses everyone, the outsiders, the vulnerable, and he can use us. Jesus then paid the ultimate sacrifice of death on a cross and defeated sin and the grave to give us all the opportunity to be redeemed back into his family. So just as Ruth cared for Naomi, and just as Boaz cared for Ruth, when we care for those around us, we get to take part in God's redemption story to bring his children back into his family. And the third thing, we care for both the church community and the wider community. Ruth was a Moabite, so when she returned to Bethlehem with Naomi, she was an outsider, maybe even what you could call an immigrant. Moabites tended to be seen as enemies of Israelites, God's chosen people who lived in Bethlehem. But Naomi and Boaz did not see this as a reason to exclude her from God's family. Just as Ruth was cared for by God's people, we are called to care for those beyond our circle of friends, beyond the walls of this church, and sometimes beyond our comfort zone. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm from America. I moved here actually June of 2023. So I've been here for 3 years this month, which seems like it was a long, long time ago, actually. But I remember the very first time I walked through those doors, I was probably the complete opposite of what you see today. Very shy, didn't really reach out to people. It was very difficult to talk to people. And I remember feeling very much like an outsider when I walked into this church. Not because the church made me feel like that, but because I knew I was walking into a space where I knew no one. I had moved to a brand new city where I knew no one, and I was on my own. But that night, after I walked out of those doors, I felt so welcomed, and I knew that this was the exact place God wanted me. And it was because the community in this church made me feel included. Just like Boaz and Naomi made Ruth feel included in their community, I felt very, very included in this community. And I'm going to be honest, my life would not look the same today had I not been approached by people. People didn't sit by and wait for me to approach them. They pulled me into their group, where I found some of my closest friends, actually. And from that, I know I've been called that my responsibility is no longer to just sit by idly and let people approach me, but actually to make sure I reach out to those who may feel like an outsider, who may not feel, comfortable walking into a church for their very first time. Those who are like me, maybe, who are walking into this church, moving from a completely different country. So as someone who was a bit like a Ruth when I moved to Portsmouth, I encourage you to think about someone that you love who may tend to live on the outside. Pull them in, love them, have them over for dinner, because from experience, it does change people's lives. God's redemption through Ruth came through a caring community. Our acts of care, whatever they may look like, big or small, are ultimately a part of God's eternal redemption story. And how cool is it that if we call Jesus our Lord and Savior, we are called not to just read about Jesus' care and love for others, but to go and act it out in our everyday lives. So I'm going to give us a little task, but before I do that, I'm going to invite the band up. I'm going to ask you all to get your phones out. That's my first step. You can get your phones out. You've been a really, really great group of students right now who weren't sitting on their phones, so I really appreciate it. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think in your own head about someone that may need some love and care poured on them right now. Maybe they are going through a financial hardship. Maybe they've just had a baby. Maybe they're changing jobs and it wasn't what they expected. Maybe they're grieving. I mean, the list could go on and on, right? But I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I'm going to time you to think of someone in your head, all right? It's okay to sit in the silence for 30 seconds. Go. Okay. Hopefully you've got a name in your head. All right? What I want you to do, I have my phone with me, so I can do this too. So you guys aren't just doing it on your own. What I want to do is I want you to go into your calendar, or there's kind of different options, or you can think of one yourself. I want you to go into your calendar. If you go into your calendar and look at this week, I want you to find a time, maybe hopefully convenient for you and potentially whoever this other person is, to block out a space, and hopefully like an hour. If a half an hour is all that fits, that's fine. To block out a space, write their name in it, and what you're going to do is, you can also do this now if you want, message them and say, are you free during this time? I'd really like to catch up. Or is it that they need a meal? Can you cook a meal and bring them a meal? Or is it you go grab a coffee and bring them a coffee, right? You can also think of your own ideas. I think you guys are very creative people. So, but the point of this is that these people potentially really need genuinely caring, looking after right now. And so what I want you to do is genuinely check in on them. It's not the classic British, hi, you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. You okay? Yeah, all good. And then walk away, right? That happens every day right, with everyone we interact with. So the last thing I want us to remember when